Hello and welcome everyone to another exciting edition of the Magic Sandwich Show, where it is a huge pleasure to be joined by hogtiechamp, Concordance, Ozzy and Shanna. Welcome everyone, how are we all?
Very good, thanks.
Great.
I'm almost good.
And Concordance, you're there as well, aren't you?
I'm here.
There we go. This is show number 98, if figures are to be believed, which I'm not sure they are, but it works out quite nicely that we have our 100th show in a month's time, which coincides pretty much with my birthday. So we're going to try and make that an exciting edition. And the long-awaited discussion about why we still believe in gods and why religion permeates through the ages, I think we're going to leave for that show, because there are quite a few other topics that we're going to be discussing during the course of this show. And also, I'm kind of thinking we should get a special guest, or maybe two special guests, on for the 100th show. There are a couple of people I have in mind that have been on previously. Andrew Copson, who is the head of the British Humanist Association, that I thought was a great contributor to the programme. I think that it's shortly before Matt, Aaron and Seth fly off to Australia, so we could get maybe Matt Dillahunty on. I'm not sure he's going to be available. I'm just putting it out there as an idea. So for the 100th show, this is the first question I have to the audience. Who would you like to see as a special guest? It doesn't have to be anyone I've named. Post a comment, let us know what you think, and we will do our best to get someone on. We'll leave it to you. Anyway, I like to start the show these days with a little quiz to see which one of the panelists has been keeping up to date with the news. And I've got a few questions for you. The first one is, there's a recent Pew study has been done in America. So those in America should have an advantage, but we'll see. In this study, can you tell me what percentage of Americans considered that global warming was due to humans? This is the average American in the street. Who would like to go first? Well, I'm going to take it in the way I see people. So I'm going to start with Hogtie. What percentage of the average American thinks that climate change, to be precise, is caused by humans?
41%.
41. I'm going to have to write these down, because we've got 4 now. I can't remember 4. I can maybe remember 3. Concordance.
63%.
63. Ozzy? You might have to unmute yourself, or...
Sorry about that.
Give me an
Dodging the question. Once again, dodging the question.
I think the number of people who believe that climate change is happening is fairly high, but the number of Americans who think that climate change is caused by humans, I think, is probably fairly low. So I think everyone else is overestimated. So I'm going to go around 25%.
25. And Shanna, who is in the latest few shows, is winning hands down so far as her accuracy in these things is concerned. What would you reckon, Shanna?
I'm around 56.
56. Wow. Well, I have to say, Shanna takes it again.
Good grief.
She is just winning hands down in these things. The figure is 50%.
Wow.
So she was closest. Hogtie was not far off. He was 9 away. Okay, so a supplementary question. How many scientists... Excuse me, I've got something in my eye. How many scientists in the American Association for the Advancement of Science answered that question positively, namely that climate change is caused by humans? So we're now talking about the scientists in the American Association of Advancements in Science, and I think it's only fair to take it in reverse order. Shanna.
Okay, ask the question one more time.
Sure. The same question was asked. Is climate change caused by humans? But this time it was asked to the scientists in the American Association of Advancement in Science. What percentage said yes, it was?
Oh, I don't know, because I think...
I know you don't know, that's why I'm asking. It's kind of fun.
Well, I know that. Well, I mean, because I think scientists would say that it may be accelerated by humans, but not caused by humans. So 18%.
18. Okay.
Going the other way with it.
Again, hopefully in the reverse order. It's Aussie to go next.
Jeez.
That's a little bit quicker than last time.
My intuitions are really backwards here. Geez, I would think it would be higher. I'd say 75.
75. Concordance.
90%.
90. And hogtie.
Yeah, it's 96, 90, 98. Call it
96
97.
or 98. It doesn't really matter, actually, because concordance wins this one. 87%.
Woohoo!
So congratulations. There we go. I thought that was quite interesting. In fact, I thought 87 was like hogtie. I thought that was a bit low.
AAAS is it's a pretty diverse group. You've got pretty much anybody with cash in hand. So I would be surprised if that didn't represent a slight skewing of the population there.
Okay, this isn't quite as topical as I thought it was when I first found this question this week, but how many, as a percentage, how many Catholic priests does the Pope accept are paedophiles, as of a statement made by him in July 2014?
When you say accept, you mean how many known pedophiles are accepted as priests by the Pope?
I can put a link in, but I think this is an estimation that he made. It's not an admission.
The prevalence is, I believe, the proper term. What is the prevalence of pedophilia among Catholic priests?
Not accepted endorsement.
Accepted by the pontiff himself, July 2014. So let's start with hogtie.
As a percentage?
Mm-hmm.
I mean, there's a lot of priests in the world. I mean, if he said 1%, I mean,
that's my supplementary question. Don't get ahead. And don't start thinking how many priests are around the world, because that will be cheating.
Yeah. Oh, I got to go with 1%. I mean,
1%. Concordance.
Darn, that was going to be my answer. I'll go high, 5%.
You can take the same answer if you like.
5%.
5. Aussie.
I have to say 1% unless I'm not allowed to.
No,
give
you're
the same
allowed
answer.
to.
We can split the points.
One or less than one.
I'm going to go crazy high and say 37%.
Yeah.
Come on.
That's crazy high. I think the points they've got to go to hogtie and Aussie. 2% he accepts. Now, I hope you haven't been Googling, and hogtie looks as if he has been. I can see that shifty look in his eye. How many Catholic priests are there in the world, and what does that 2% equate to? What does the 2% equate to? If you know one, you can easily work out the other. So, again, we'll go reverse order. Shanna.
Oh, man, I don't know. Say...
To the nearest 1,000, I'll make it easy.
All right, 20,000.
20,000.
We were asking how many priests are there, or we're asking how many of them are pedophiles?
According to the 2% statistic, how many are pedophiles?
Oh, man. I'm going to say 6,000.
6. Aussie?
Wait, how many priests there are, or how many pedophile priests?
Not how many priests there are. How many, according to the Pope's figure of 2%, how many pedophile priests does that make?
Oh, good grief. I don't. 5,000.
5,000 and hogtie.
I had Googled this, but it was months ago how many priests there were in the context of how many bishops. I think it was 50,000 or something like that. I'm going to go with 1,000 pedophiles.
Okay.
I just forgot the number, unfortunately.
Was it concordance that said 6?
Yes.
You're closest. 8,000. There are roughly just over 400,000 Catholic.
400. I was off by an order of magnitude.
You're confusing it, I think, with bishops.
That might be the bishops, yeah.
Yeah. All right. Let's before we get into the show. I love this one. It's a multiple choice, so it makes it easy for you. What name did a French court recently stop a child from being named? Was it Champagne? Was it Nutella? Or was it Frog? Who wants to go first?
I'll go.
Go on.
I'm going Nutella.
Okay.
That's my guess, Nutella.
Okay.
Oh dear. Well, I know that champagne is actually a controlled word. Not anything can be called champagne. It's a region of France, and sparkling wines from that region can be called champagnes, but not any old sparkling wine is a champagne. So it's possible that somehow that was blocked. Yeah, I'll go with champagne.
Okay.
I was going to.
hog tie.
Yeah, I like Ozzy's answer, but I'll go with my gut. It was Nutella.
Well, at one point to all three of you, I thought I'd fool more of you with champagne because of the reason Ozzy explained. But yeah, Nutella. Couldn't call their child Nutella, not because of any sort of like copyright or intellectual property laws, just because the court deemed it to be unfair. I didn't know.
See, I assumed it was because of some sort of copyright issue, and they didn't want the kid representing their brand. They give a lot of powers. Some courts give a lot of powers to trademarking.
Yeah, that was my view.
But apparently not. It was just they thought it was unfair. I'll post a link to the news article about it, which also includes some other interesting, funny names, which we may come on to. There's another question, but I'm going to leave that. Let's get on with the show.
Can I complain first?
Sorry?
I have to complain just a little bit. So can I declare myself the winner of the quiz for the previous show, even though I was sick? Because I was listening to it on headphones, and I crushed Shanna.
No. There's no evidence to suggest that that's the case.
No, it's so frustrating when you're listening to the broadcast and you're not in it, and you ask a question like, well, how many Muslims are victims of Muslim terrorist attacks? And I was like, well, 95%. And it wasn't 95-ish, it was 95%. I didn't have the flu. I crushed her. What did I get?
For the record, though, I won this week's.
Okay.
Yeah, I think I haven't really been keeping an accurate score, but I think that Shanna, on the whole, has won you all, to use the expression of a famous theist.
Well, for last week, she gets an asterisk for last week's victory from 2 weeks ago.
No, I think if you're not there when you sit the exam,
must be present to win.
I don't think that you can claim you have a pass or fail or whatever. You're just absent. That's it. End of story.
I think I scored lowest on every one of these quizzes, so that makes me the best at losing.
Yeah.
Is that a kind of victory?
If you want to take it that way.
In Loserland.
You certainly can.
Thanks.
Okay, let's move on. It was a great thrill to see, shortly before I started the show, that Concordance had recently posted a video. And when I mean recently, I mean within like the last hour or so. And I thought that would be a useful place to start. Concordance, talk us through your video and why you made it and basically what it says.
So I was watching Bill Maher. I watched this morning on HBO Go because I can't stand to watch it live because I have to leave the room sometimes. Bill Maher, as much of a, I would say, liberal, atheist, positive kind of influence he's also a germ theory denialist. He tipped his hand way back in 2007 when he started talking about how, Pasteur on his deathbed recanted. He said, no, Beauchamp was right. It's the terrain, not the germ. So he denies being a vaccine denialist or an anti-vaxxer, but he clearly is. And last night or this morning, he was what's generally been called jacking off, JAQ, just asking questions. He was representing the anti-vax perspective from this sort of mythical point of view that, I'm just asking questions. These are questions you just can't ask in this country without being labeled an anti-vaxxer. Yeah, that's right. You can't ask these kinds of dumb questions, these leading questions, without being labeled an anti-vaxxer. One of the things he did in his very arrogant way is say, well, I've been against the flu vaccine for a long time, and as the low effectiveness of the vaccine this year has shown, I was right all along. And that so fundamentally misunderstands the purpose of a vaccine, which from a very selfish and arrogant perspective is about, I don't want to get sick, so I'm going to go out and get vaccinated. That is one motivation. But if you look at vaccines as a public health initiative, there's a very different perspective. Even something with a low effectiveness can alter the basic reproduction rate of a virus as it propagates through the population. And this is really basic stuff. Everyone understands this intuitively. that there is a herd protective effect, that herd immunity prevents a virus from ripping through a population, even if only every other person gets vaccinated, every other person is resistant in some way. That slows it down. And in the case of influenza, it doesn't have a basic reproduction rate that is very high to begin with. And by altering that even just a little bit, we transform it from something that is pandemic or epidemic, something that, you know, every person is giving it to 2 or 3 people until half the population is sick, and then the reproduction rate goes down again, to something that never quite gets to that level. And that means thousands, tens of thousands, hundreds of thousands fewer people ending up in the hospital. Old people, young people, very, very young people who are vulnerable to respiratory disease don't die from it. So even a 28% effective, or more accurately, I should have said a 23% effective vaccine can save thousands, hundreds of thousands of lives globally. And so his statement was so wrong, it made me so mad. I threw my remote at the TV, the remote smashed into a million pieces, made me so mad. So I ran out and worked on that video.
And one of the figures, we were talking about this before we started, one of the figures that you used in your video came as somewhat as a surprise to me, because you said that it is 28% effective. And let's just be sure what we're referring to by using that figure. 28%, what exactly does that mean?
So the effectiveness of a vaccine can be calculated different ways. Generally what they're looking at, though, is the predicted ratio between people who show up with laboratory-confirmed disease, laboratory-confirmed influenza, those that are vaccinated and those that are unvaccinated. We would expect those to perfectly represent the ratio of people that are vaccinated. And if there's an imbalance, and there should be, you know, 100% vaccine, everyone who comes in with confirmed disease, 100% effective vaccine would prevent disease in all of the people who were vaccinated. And you would do a comparison of those two and say, aha, it's 100%. In this case, 23% fewer people who were vaccinated than would have been expected showed up with a laboratory confirmed case of the disease. So it's kind of hard to wrap your brain around that, but what you can say is it reduces the number of transmission events that have occurred by about 23%. That's how it fits into the equations. What I think you heard, and we were talking about this earlier, is the effectiveness was only 3%. Right, which is...
That's exactly what I was just about to come on to. The headline figure that we were given, or I heard on the news, was 3%.
And I didn't find a source for that. I didn't do a deep search for that. But my understanding is that number is among people who were considered at risk or life-threatening. That was the rate of reduction in hospitalizations. So there were 3% fewer hospitalizations as a result of influenza in a vaccinated population that was considered at risk. And that's generally people over the age of 65 or under the age of 4, I think. And how they crunch those numbers, the scientists completely understand. You know, there was a 3% impact on deaths, essentially. But it's reported in the news as 3% effective. That's not really what we mean as epidemiologists. That's not what they mean when they say effectiveness. Right? It's just bad science reporting.
Okay.
Oh yeah, I think you covered it reasonably well. This was a point I wanted to raise, which maybe we can cycle back to it after we discuss concordance's video. But this is a question that comes up quite a bit in the anti-vax discussion. Well, you know, if your kids are vaccinated, then what do you care? You know, because your kids are obviously protected. And this is a question that I've seen 3 times in the last week, where I had hoped to answer it on the show today, is how can this happen? And I guess the simple answer is not how it happens, but the thing to remember, I think this is worth highlighting for people, is that just because you're vaccinated doesn't mean you're protected against the disease. So you can take your vaccinated people and divide them into 2 groups, and there's vaccinated protected people and vaccinated unprotected people. And as I think concordance laid out one metric of the effectiveness, and that basically it's looking at it like, when you get the vaccination, do you actually gain protection? Does it stick? Do these memory cells form? And we have to acknowledge with vaccines, in some people it doesn't. And we're talking about human bodies here, right? We're not robots. We're different, and some people react to stimuli differently. And with every vaccine, and depending on the number of exposures to the vaccine, there'll always be some people for whom the vaccine doesn't stick. So I guess maybe I don't want to derail Concordance's point here, but just sort of people should keep that in mind, that when you get a vaccine, you might get some protection for a period of time, and there will always be some percentage of the people for whom that doesn't stick. Now, how you measure it is a bit of a tricky issue. There is a bias inherent in the method that Concordance was mentioning. It tends to slightly underestimate the effectiveness. You can actually do titers on blood samples from vaccinated people, like say a year later, and confirm whether or not they've got those memory cells. But in any case, I don't want to take us too far down that path. As long as people know that that's one of the things, you can sort of very roughly divide people into two groups: the vaccinated protected and the vaccinated unprotected.
And in this case, the reason why the vaccine was less effective than some previous years, although there have been plenty of years in the past where the effectiveness was lower than this one, in recent memory, the reason why this one was less effective had to do with antigenic drift. They have to make this vaccine in advance, and using surveillance mostly of what we call the Far East, right, Asian countries. Based on observations made there, we predict how those disease patterns are going to spread to North America and Europe, and we order up a big batch made of these vaccines for particular particular types of influenza markers. And sometimes those predictions don't play out the way we think they will. And as a result, in this case, the major strains of flu antigenically drifted, became less recognizable when compared to the vaccine strain. And that happens from time to time. I also think that our vaccines could be much improved, right? We could make them a lot broader spectrum protection. But even when they are not a match for the influenza you've been exposed to, there's a lot of cross protection. It's not perfect protection. And what that normally manifests itself as is you get the flu, but you get a greatly reduced severity of the flu. Maybe you get, instead of a week and a half of suffering, right, you get 4 or 5 days of suffering, even just 2 or 3 days of, moderate flu. Maybe you mistake it for a cold. So, we only count, when we're counting the effectiveness of a vaccine, the laboratory confirmed cases that were matched up. If you say 3%, it could be that they're coming up with the 3% as an antigenic match, meaning that if you take blood from people who are exposed, the antibodies they've developed are only 3% match to the strain of the vaccine. So the important thing is that if enough people are vaccinated, you dramatically change the course of the disease. Even if it's a fairly low effectiveness or it's not quite the right strain, it's still doing its job.
Yeah, I think this is partly why science is so difficult. Science reporting is so difficult, is because people like simple stories. They like to know, like when you ask somebody how a football game went, you're going to get 2 numbers. This team got this score, this team got that score, it's obvious who won. But in science reporting, these things are difficult, because if you ask how effective a vaccine is, there are different metrics of its impact. And even if you talk about this success rate, that is, how many people have developed for how many people did the vaccine stick? Did they develop the memory cells so that they're effective in beating this thing? Well, there's going to be an effectiveness relative to this strain of a virus, and effectiveness relative to this strain of a virus, and even then, as Concordance points out, there isn't. It doesn't give you sort of an obvious way of interpreting what the path or the course of a virus is going to be overall in a population, and that's why the science reporting on these things is awfully tricky.
You know, it's worth pointing out that measles is one of the most contagious diseases. I think this has been covered in the U.S. media pretty heavily. But, you know, the basic reproduction rate of something like influenza is around 1.3, maybe as high as 2 or 3 for pandemic flu. And for something like Ebola, it's around 2. With something like measles, it's 10 to 15. I've seen numbers far higher than that, meaning each person can infect 15 other people, and in fact does. And the only way we managed to contain it in the years before vaccine development, of course, it did rip through the population. We did have millions of cases, and only a very rare number of them resulted in some sort of a life-threatening illness. The only way we managed to contain the basic reproduction rate, make them less epidemic, was with just pure isolation. You had to quarantine everyone who showed even the earliest signs or symptoms. And you know, we're going to have to head back that way. Right now, people don't recognize the signs and symptoms. So even that pre-vaccine strategy, many healthcare providers are not prepared to recognize and quarantine individuals with measles. And the mothers or fathers, the parents of children who are infected, don't see the need for it. They don't understand. They haven't lived through a measles epidemic. It is a terrifying disease. It still kills tens of thousands of people a year in countries other than the U.S., right? Because we've got it so neatly under control. We almost had it eradicated. It was almost just gone from the U.S. We've stopped tracking the statistics anymore. And here it comes roaring back. And I think we'll see in the next probably 10 years escalating amounts of measles. Right?
Oh, definitely. Yeah. Yeah, I was going to say, too, that this is part of the reason why it's important that people, and especially physicians, know that there's such a thing as vaccinated, unprotected people, because this is one of the mistakes that's made is in differential diagnosis, when somebody comes in and they start displaying these different symptoms, and then you know, maybe they had been visiting another country and they returned, and then a child in the family is sick, and you start looking and going, wow, geez, I don't know, there's sort of measles-like, but did you get your measles shots? Oh yeah, no, the kid's been inoculated against measles. Well, I guess it can't be that. And that's a pretty common mistake. And it is true. I mean, I'll tell you, when I went to school, I actually, lifelong, I still have not seen a case of measles. There are like a lot of things that you learn about in school. They have to show you photos of things, like there's some insect-related diseases in other countries of the world. Well, obviously, a guy going to school in Canada is not going to see those bugs, so they have to show you video clips and things like that. But measles, which actually used to be endemic in Canada, by the time I went to school, we had to rely on photographs from the 1960s and video from other countries. So, and I apologize, a moment ago, so I had a blank look on my face. I forgot my point, and then I suddenly remembered it in concordance with speaking again. And that was, we can talk about these different rates of effectiveness, and talk about 3% and 23% and that sort of thing. And those metrics, see, well, those are kind of low numbers. However you measure effectiveness, it turns out that the actual impact of a vaccination program doesn't really hinge that much on how high those numbers are. You don't need a 98% effective vaccine, however you want to dice and slice effectiveness. It turns out that the course of an infection is reliable across a lot of different epidemics and communicable diseases, the word I'm looking for, and that is that the parameter that turns out to sort of be the biggest handle on setting the course for it is the vaccination rate, and then second, of course, the frontline medical response when these diseases start to appear in a community. Those are really the two biggest drivers, with the vaccination rate being the biggest driver, even more important than first-line medical response.
Yeah, that's really important. Actually, I haven't looked into the figures, but I live in Ontario, Canada, and back in around 2001 or so, the provincial government instituted a program of free vaccinations, no-charge vaccinations. You can go to any doctor, you can go to any clinic, you can go to any pharmacist and have a flu vaccine. And apparently, this has saved untold millions of dollars, just because it frees up hospital beds. People are not and literally on their deathbeds, requiring extraordinary measures to keep them alive, usually the elderly. So it saved a lot of lives in children and the elderly, and it saved millions of dollars accordingly in hospital stays. And so it's actually a prudent financial investment to institute a policy like this. There have been tremendous savings, even though it's not cheap to do, and even though the efficacy of this is going to change from year to year for the reasons that have already been discussed. And I want to pick up on one point that Concordance was making. And first, let me say, if you haven't seen his video, please watch it. It's 5 minutes. It's really very succinct, very, very clearly explained. It's the perfect video to send to someone who is on Facebook and social media, doing this anti-vax thing. Go ahead, send them that video. It's a good antidote. It might not change their mind, but it might inoculate other people against this kind of nonsense. But the point I want to pick up on is just we really don't appreciate how vaccines are victims of their own success. Right. That is, I think, an important take-home message. Almost none of us alive today remember these epidemics. Like Hogtie said, we have to sort of look them up in books and see photos of these diseases that used to be endemic. They were commonplace. My dad, I remember him telling me stories about polio, and how if anyone exhibited the merest sign of what could be polio, nobody would go to school. Right, that's it. School was closed. Why? Because one of these kids had been there, and now anybody there in that school could be infected, and so you couldn't go to school. Right, and this could go on for weeks. We've lost sight of this completely. We don't even remember this now. It seems like it's like a vestigial memory. So vaccines have been so effective that we are now suffering. We're from the fact that. They have been so successful that people have a hard time believing that the way things go if we don't vaccinate is actually completely different than the way things are. I mean, we're inductive creatures. We look at how things are around us and we assume this is the norm. And so when people say without vaccines it would be very different, they find it impossible to believe. And I have a question for Concordance afterwards.
Well, I was hoping to spin this off in a different direction, if that's all right.
Yeah.
Sure.
Related. If you would raise your hand on the panel
as well, but you go first.
Raise your hand on the panel if you've ever had strep throat. Yeah, everyone has, right? And it's miserable. Ozzy, you've never had strep throat?
Not by that name. I may have had it by a different name.
Yeah, not diagnosed as such. I suspect I did, but I didn't want to raise my hand because I don't know for a fact that I did.
It's so prevalent. It's something that kids growing up all seem to get at one point or another. My kids have all had strep throat at various times. It makes you feel horrible. I mean, it really does take the life out of you. It takes the enthusiasm. There was a young boy in Calgary. His name is Ryan Lovett, and his mother treated him for his strep throat with homeopathy. And for 10 days, she continued to use herbal and homeopathic remedies. And then eventually they rushed him to the hospital, where it became obvious he was having difficulty breathing. He was going into sepsis, and he died in the hospital after 10 days of what must have been misery. And now they're looking at, do we prosecute? And I think they're going to prosecute this woman who did what she thought was right. And I think you have to respect the difficulties any parent faces in making the right medical choices for their child. And that's why I see the connection here is this misinformation, this medical abuse in its own way, is abuse of the parents and the child. That we're filling parents' heads with misinformation, and they're not malicious people. They're doing what they think is the best thing for their child, and the net effect is worse health for everyone, whether that's vaccines or something like this. One of the things Mar said that really honestly got me so angry I was shaking is he went on a rant about the overuse of antibiotics, which I completely agree. Antibiotics have been overused. We don't really need them in our hand soap. We don't really need them in our mouthwash necessarily. This is a problem, right? It's ending up in our runoff water. It's ending up in our agriculture system, right? We're using common antibiotics to make cows put on weight faster. That's not a responsible use of what we've been given. But this little boy would be alive and healthy today if he had gone to the doctor and gotten some, Z-Packs, treated his strep throat, and he would have been better within probably 48 hours. But I guess that's the challenge that I want to put to the panel, is to what extent do you think parents are to blame for trusting false information or fad information about health decisions for their kids?
Who would like to go first?
I'm loaded up on this one.
Go for it.
I think we got to dial it up a bunch. I think it's a lot, and I have a very small amount of sympathy, but some sensitivity to this idea that, well, these parents intend well, right? I mean, it's not like this woman. I guess we can draw the distinction, sort of philosophically or morally, between a parent who says, I really love my child, so I'm going to make some warm honey mixture for him and put in some shredded onion skin or whatever the quacks tell me to do, because I really love my son and I want the best for him, versus somebody who just doesn't care, like they're a crack addict who just doesn't take care of their kids or whatever their problem is. We can draw that philosophical and moral distinction, and I think that those things are relevant at sentencing, but the duty to care for your children doesn't mean a duty to care in your heart. I adore my kids and I really care about them. The legal duty is established by the criminal code, which would apply in this case in Calgary. That duty means to provide care, and there's a lot of elements to going into providing that care. One of the duties that's there is, and this is a responsibility that parents should be accepting when they become parents. It's not just to care in your heart to do the right things, but you have to step up and make the best use of information available to you to learn what the right course of action is, right? It's not just about, I'm going to do what I think is right, and as long as I sort of have the best intentions, that's fine, and the courts shouldn't care. As a parent, you have the responsibility to know what ought to be done in circumstances for your kids, like what the right things to feed them are, when they need to go to school, what kind of activities they should be doing, and specifically when it comes to medical care, you need to know the signs of when your kid has to get medical attention, and to, if anything, be a little bit hair-triggered and take your kids to. Again, keep in mind too, this is Calgary, so this is not a person who was sitting there going, well, I don't know if I can afford the $400 for the doctor's visit, or they're sitting there weighing the money. The only thing that's weird about Calgary is that if you call for an ambulance, they charge you in the order of $400 for the ambulance ride. But that's not a factor here. Everything else, like once you get to the hospital, everything else is free. So the parents have a duty to understand when it's important to take your kids to the hospital, and they have a duty to act on it.
Shanna, you've been quiet. I think you've admitted yourself in public that you've got, I think, 3 or 4 children. What's your take on this?
Yeah, this is actually really upsetting. My son has strep throat right now. He was complaining of a sore throat, and he had real low fever, like 100 or so, Wednesday, I think it was. And by Friday morning, I had him at a doctor because the symptoms were the same. They weren't worsening, but they were still the same, which means no improvement, so I took him to the damn doctor. In the meantime, I made sure that he was taking his vitamins and eating healthy and getting his fluids and getting his rest, not going to school and whatnot, But if the symptoms don't improve, you take the kid to the doctor. So it makes me angry. So I don't know how I don't know how unbiased my view on this could be, but I think that parents should be held responsible for this. I don't care if they're misinformed. The information's out there. Anybody that takes something at face value that's fed to them by Fox News, it's their responsibility to educate themselves and find out what the actual information is, what the actual data is. I mean, children die needlessly over this. This pisses me off. It's completely absurd.
There are physicians, family physicians that people take their kids to in southern LA. Let's say Southern California, where the culture of the doctors, I don't know how they're supporting this, is to customize vaccine schedules and offer no antibiotic therapy kind of things. But my impression is that those doctors then immediately go to the effective therapies when they see something life-threatening going on.
Right.
How responsible are the parents if their doctors are giving them bad advice? It should be medical malpractice to me.
Well, that muddies the waters. That muddies the waters, but then it also that also helps the supervising colleges and professional associations, take action against those doctors. And we need to see more of that too. That when you get doctors that are giving bad, sort of hokey advice to people, that needs to be addressed. One other little bit of trivia too about where this happened. This happened in Calgary, where the provincial government has set up the Alberta Health Link. So when you have a child in Alberta, you get fridge magnets with this phone number you can call. And when you call this phone number, you don't listen to hold music and you don't sort of wait. There's a registered nurse on the phone. Anyone in Alberta can call this number for any sort of health advice at all. And if you have a child, they kind of thrust this information on you. They keep giving you pamphlets and magnets to put on your fridge and whatnot. There's just no way that this woman can claim that she didn't have access to that source of information. Literally a registered nurse who you could phone up like your old high school friend and get some advice on. And if she would have called Alberta Health Link, she would have been guided through a series of steps that would have got her child to a hospital for free.
If I may, I want to direct the conversation. Sorry, Ozzy. If your point was relative, please go on. But I want to point it in a direction that sort of like Shanna kind of touched upon, and that is whether parents should be held responsible because, to use I think your word, Shanna, the information is out there. I agree largely with what you're saying, but there's an awful lot of misinformation out there. And is it right to blame a parent for accepting some information and not other information? I'm not talking here necessarily about the extremes of going to a witch doctor rather than a medically qualified person, but there's an awful lot of misinformation, and for someone who is uneducated in medicine, unlike yourself, who you've got a very good grasp of these things, but for someone who isn't fully educated as you are, is it right to blame them?
I don't know. I mean, my knee-jerk reaction is to say yes. I mean, because here, I mean, we can go to the CDC. I can go to that website and I can get information, good information that's sourced. There's, like, I'm in the dental field. You can go to the ADA, their website, at any time and get any information that you need about dentistry. You don't have to get your information from a Colgate commercial. I mean, maybe I'm speaking from a side of the fence and I can't see the other, but for me, like, when this all came out initially about vaccines cause autism and don't vaccinate your kids, and I researched it. I looked for the information. I didn't take anybody's word for it. I looked for the data. That's the first thing that I did. I don't see how that's complicated. But then again, maybe I'm giving people too much credit.
But if you go to
I don't know how to put that.
You go first, good call.
So if you go to Whole Foods and you go down their alternative medicine aisle, and Whole Foods and many pharmacies have this stocked on the shelves next to, the Flintstone vitamins and the actual effective treatments for actual conditions, I don't think that the average consumer should be expected to have acquired the skills necessary to discern when something is good advice and when something is bad advice, to the point where they can be held entirely responsible for their lack of education, their upbringing, whatever it may be, or we're failing to teach people to discern between things that are effective and things that are not. There's certainly people who spend their time, as you say, listening to Fox News, or I would go much further than that. I would say something like Natural News, Health Ranger. This guy is making a lot of money by producing very slightly slanted news stories on everything health related. And it's driving money towards an industry which is benefiting from medical misinformation. Can you entirely hold someone responsible for for failing to recognize that scientific knowledge is superior to knowledge you read about on Alex Jones?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, think about this woman with this child. He's getting more and more sick as every day passes.
Right.
Right. She had to at least understood what a fever means. You know, fever's a red flag. That means the body's doing something. She's not seeing any progress. She's not seeing her little baby boy get any better at all every day. Something should have triggered in her head. You know, I mean, how many days does something have to fail? How many days does a child have to suffer with the fever and the pain that comes with strep throat, and her not go, you know, I don't think that these herbs are working. I mean, so yeah, I still say yes, even though a person doesn't have the education or doesn't know what a good reliable source is, you know, which I get that people don't, you know where to go for their data. I get that, but the facts are staring them in their face with sick and dying people.
So there was a case in 2009, very similar. A lot of comparisons have been made where a little girl, Glorious Sam, in the UK. So this is a few years ago, but in the UK, her parents treated her eczema with homeopathy. Her eczema, and her eczema eventually led to septic infections and her death. She was a very little girl, and this of course was over the course of months. You know, would cyclically, she'd get better, they'd attribute that to the homeopathy. She'd get worse, they'd attribute that to the discontinuing the homeopathy. You know, the father was a homeopath. That was part of how he made his living, and I think his internal worldview required that he be consistent. It would create cognitive dissonance for someone who was a homeopath, who sold the homeopathic solutions or created them or provided a service, to then say, well, when my little girl gets sick, I need to take her to the doctor. Again, I agree with you all. It just creates for me a little bit of discomfort that I'm so angry at the parents, and I'm blaming the parents for the death of these children, and I wonder if I'm being really fair to them, because I cannot put myself in their shoes. I cannot imagine my mind working in a different way, and I don't know how much legal obligation they should feel, but I feel they have an ethical obligation to be better educated and more skeptical when the lives of their children are on the line.
There's an important philosophical issue here with respect to legal obligations and ethical obligations and skepticism. What this points to is that doing your due diligence and being skeptical is in fact a moral imperative, right? I mean, it is literally something that can mean life or death. And when you're in charge of another human being, when you're a parent, right, you are responsible for what happens to that child. That child can't fend for itself. So I actually take a fairly strong line on this. And unfortunately, as a commenter in watching this right now, marked Niboop said, you know, Hogtie and Ozzy ought to know that there was a Canadian ruling recently that upheld someone, a native person's right to administer traditional healing methods instead of Western scientifically vindicated medical practices, resulting in the death of a child. I mean, this was actually upheld in a court. You know, it's disastrous. That's going entirely in the wrong direction. What needs to happen is the opposite. We need to actually take a much harder line on this and demand that people exercise some due diligence here. And it's not enough to say there's a lot of misinformation out there. There's always, on every subject, misinformation out there. I mean, there's information telling us that we live on a flat Earth, you know, that the sun orbits the Earth, and you know, all kinds of craziness out there. That's never an excuse, right? Ignorance of the law isn't an excuse, and ignorance of factual matters is never ignorance. You are always morally responsible for the predictable consequences of your actions, not the predicted consequences of your actions. Not what you would have predicted, but what you should have predicted had you bothered to get informed. Now, if we lived in an environment where the correct information was simply unavailable, or simply lost in a sea of misinformation, and all of the relevant experts, or a significant number of the relevant experts, were misinforming you, then that would be very different. But we don't live in that situation. Now, concordance, you gave the example of some doctors in California that sort of have this kind of custom hippie new age practice tailored to people with certain preferences, medical preferences. Those people, I think, if something happens, they have a case, so that when they're in court, these kinds of considerations can enter into the case as mitigating factors, and it might affect sentencing. But it doesn't mean that we have to, simply write this off as, well, they meant well, and what else could you do? I mean, the road to hell is paved with good intentions, right? It's never going to be enough. That we have to craft our social policies based on objective information that we have, and we don't have to. We can't be beholden to the fact that it seems cruel and unusual to prosecute a parent that's just lost a child. And I think that's one of the things that happens here. I mean, this poor mother has lost her child. She loved her 7-year-old son, and 2 years later she's being prosecuted for it now. She's going to be going off to jail. I mean, this is nightmarish and Kafkaesque. It has to be admitted. But if we don't have policies like this, people are really going to be stupid and irresponsible. Shanna pointed out that this woman saw her child getting sicker and sicker. What that means is she was stubbornly clinging to a bogus set of medical beliefs, right? Stubbornly, in the face of contrary evidence, in the face of her son exhibiting this, right? I think that makes you criminally liable. This is criminally negligent behavior. So yeah, I think we can prosecute. We don't have to do it happily. We don't have to be gleeful and delight in it and with a kind of retributionist spirit. We can just say, as a matter of social policy, the only way these kinds of cases are going to diminish and not increase is if we change our policies to be more punitive. That's my view.
One quick correction before we move on, or move to someone else, is Michaela, the First Nations little girl who sought out traditional medical practices, was not actually seeking out traditional practices.
No, she wasn't.
She went to the Hippocrates Institute in Florida, where they treated her with cool lasers and enemas of some sort. These were all faddish, new age. They were not traditional medical practices, which would be, I think, a whole different discussion than they were just straight up fad, new age kind of stuff.
Yeah, but the court ruling did uphold the right of the parents, right, on the basis that they were natives and they should be able to exercise traditional native practices. That's why I mentioned that. But yeah, you're correct.
But the ruling was sickening. The terms used, and we talked about this on the last show, were something along the lines of a few dead kids aren't going to ruin a 1,000-year-old culture, which to me is the most sickening concept I can possibly imagine.
Well, that's one of the issues that I noticed that you discussed in the last show. Again, when I was kind of jumping through my headset.
Can I just pause you for one second? I just want to remind people, if they want to join the conversation, I've got a couple of people lined up, but if you want to join the conversation, please send a Skype contact request to Magic Sandwich Show, and we'll see if we can get you on. Hogtie, I'm sorry, carry on.
There is and I did go back after that last episode and look up the ruling, and there is one important distinction that in other countries of the world you might not sort of recognize. Canadians have a very strange approach that would seem unusual to people outside of Canada. We didn't really have a war with our natives. We set up a system of treaties with them, and we're in this very, very weird legal place in the 21st century with the Aboriginal peoples of Canada, because keep in mind these are treaties, right? That is to say, an agreement between nations, and there's a reason why we refer to them as the First Nations. So it's this weird thing of like we sort of still recognize that the Canadian natives are their own nation, and yet it's sort of within Canada. And there's these really weird, peculiar things like if say there's a reservation within a particular province. Land surveyors, for example, can't survey on their reserve, but the police still will go in to arrest people if they have a warrant for them, and we have this really weird sort of interaction with them. So, and I think that the judges, reviewing this other case that were this Michaela, were they had a lot more on their plate than this woman in Calgary, because there is sort of an arm's length interaction we have with the natives, and that's not going to apply to an urbanite woman in Calgary, Alberta, which, like I say, at some point would have been given a fridge magnet with a phone number she could have called a registered nurse. So that is an important distinction that I think we sort of missed on the last episode, and it's kind of hard to explain anyway.
Well, I'm going to bring in a first caller in a second, but
I think Shanna wanted to say something.
Oh, I'm sorry.
Yeah, it's okay. There was just two things I wanted to touch on, and just because just in case anyone's listening and hears this and doesn't know differently. Earlier, Hogtie said something about titers and doctors not running titers. They generally do. If they do a blood panel on you when you're sick and they're trying to rule things out, a titer panel is pretty normal practice. If your doctor doesn't, for these vaccines, to see if the vaccination's stuck, if you have the immunity to it, or at least the resistance, you can go to almost any lab, and they'll do it for $20, $35. And working in the medical field, I have to have a hepatitis vaccination, and they could do a surface titer for $7 to make sure. So I mean, I think that's important. Doctors generally do run titers, and if they don't, you can get it done yourself for very cheap. And then if you're not,
yeah, that was my point. It's something that should be done, but there are cases where they don't, because they will. And I'm sorry. And when I mentioned that, I guess I should have made clear that would be an example of a medical mistake. That's a very to shrug and say, well, the person has an inoculation, therefore it can't be that condition. It's sort of a quick way of doing a differential diagnosis. That's poor practice. But a lot of times decisions are made quickly, right? And that would be an example of a mistake.
I think that there's things in place that kind of protect those mistakes. Sometimes, not always. Obviously, I think that you have a good point, but a lot of insurance companies won't even pay doctors unless they've run certain tests. So they're kind of motivated, even if not by their own motives, to run. Especially if it's like an HMO here in the U.S., they have to run these titers, or the insurance company won't even pay them for the office visit. So I don't know. I just don't want anyone to think that it's like a huge problem where doctors aren't giving a shit, and doctors are like, it's not. They can't be that, because a lot of them, they can't, by the restrictions that are set up by insurance companies and by the colleges that, like around here, OSU won't keep you on staff, or won't even keep you on the list that you need to be on if you're not doing these things. So I think that there's other things in place. It's not solely up to the doctor what happens and what tests to run. The doctor he's not God in this situation. God. And then the other one was just real brief, just a tiny little thing, and it's only because sometimes people hear things and they carry it on with them for the rest of their lives. The Z-Pak does not help with strep unless you're allergic to amoxicillin or penicillin or Augmentin, anything in that family. Will they then try something like some of the other antibiotics? But Z-Pak, the zithromycin, isn't strong enough to deal with strep. So amoxicillin and penicillin, that's all.
Okay, we're joined by Cliff Jumper, who wants to talk about the anti-vaxxer stuff.
Yeah,
Hi, how you doing?
I'm fine. I'm doing very well. Ironically, I am on antibiotics right now. I've had a chest infection, and hopefully that's going away soon. A proper reason for antibiotics. I agree with what Concordance was saying. I think it was earlier on. So yeah, I've been listening quite interestingly. I'm fairly new to the reasons why people have this anti-vaxxer mentality, and having looked at it, it almost seems the same way as the fundamentalist Christians or the people who don't believe in evolution think. These are the conclusions I want to reach. What evidence can I find to support it? It's fundamentalist in behavior, and one of the, it seems to evolve. It started off with the Andrew Wakefield stuff, which was proven to be nothing but a fraud. And then sort of once it was discovered to be a fraud, it then turns into, well, yeah, but you need to know what's in these vaccines. Look how dangerous they are. Look at these chemicals that are in them. And you need to be frightened about this. And I think that's the biggest problem, that there are people that don't know what they're talking about and yet are giving advice to people. And, you know, any parent is not going to want to harm their child. And the idea of giving a child something that may hurt them is probably more frightening than the inaction of not giving them something that will also may also hurt them, or may hurt them. So, and I think that's the biggest worry for me.
Yeah, it could be even a parent deciding between what they see as, you know, some sort of crippling neurological condition. You know, maybe they think they're going to give their kid autism, and they say, well, my risk assessment of measles is that it is less of a problem. You know, it's a short-term limited disease, as opposed to something like autism, which they'll live with for the rest of their life and will affect more aspects of their life than a self-limiting infection. I just wanted to add to your point that I've been doing a lot of work on this cultural cognition. It's new to me. It's very exciting. It explains a lot about how people interpret the scientific evidence from their political point of view, that it's not a matter of not comprehending science that makes them reject the conclusions of scientists. It's not that they can't think. It's not that they're scientifically illiterate. It is that they look at the science through the prism of their particular cultural viewpoint. Dan Cahan, the guy that I've been taking cues from, did an analysis of anti-vax political viewpoints, and it's a non-political issue, which was the opposite of what I would have predicted. That is, you know, maybe the far-right libertarians are anti-vax. Maybe the ultra-liberal would be the anti-vax. That somewhere there would be some very strong correlation between political viewpoint and their position on vaccines, and it appears to span all lines based on all common cultural identifiers. Now, I don't know if they sliced it a slightly different way, if they wouldn't find, you know, the market for anti-vax and alternative medicine, but it's not something that is confined to liberals or conservatives or ultra-conservatives or ultra-liberals. The only correlation I have heard that sticks long-term is the educational status of the mother. A mother who has at least a college-level degree is more likely to be an anti-vaxxer or to choose an alternative vaccination program. They're actually calling it vaccine hesitation or vaccine refusal. Those are the two categories that the medical literature use. So I mean, we could obviously create a whole narrative out of, you know, college-educated mothers make these choices because they are more vulnerable to this or that. But regardless of whether they are conservative or liberal, does not seem to be the correlation.
Can I just clarify what you're saying? You're saying that the more educated the mother is, the less likely they are to have their children vaccinated? Or did I mishear that?
Can we repeat that? I'm sorry, I think my audio glitched.
Yeah, I think it may have done. You seem to be suggesting that if there was a correlation, it was down to the education of the mother, and the more highly educated the mother was, the less likely they were to have their children vaccinated.
Yeah, in more of a binary way. I wouldn't say the more educated, I would say college-educated mothers who completed a college degree were significantly more likely, although it's a fairly weak correlation, significantly more likely.
This sort of like doesn't seem to run with what you were saying before, that well, maybe it does. Scientific illiteracy doesn't seem to have an impact.
In this case, it's not that scientific illiteracy doesn't have an impact, it's that your cultural category, and they do, you know, this sort of hierarchical individualist, people who value individual values, the you know, authority figures I don't know how really to put it, and the other is communitarian, egalitarian, which tend to be more the liberal people who feel that everybody should get the same amount of whatever. You know, they believe the community is more important than the individual. I guess you could say Reagan-esque versus Obama-esque, but there doesn't seem to be, when you break it down by those categories, that doesn't explain the difference in whether or not people vaccinate their children. The only correlation seems to be that one fact. It has nothing to do with the father's educational status, only the mother's. I don't know. It's an odd correlation.
I have noticed another interesting thing, that the leftish mentality of has infiltrated into the right as well. You know, the big pharma on it, which makes the people on the right saying, "Oh, the big pharma on it, it's just proof the government is against me," and so on. And it's almost circular. It feeds against the middle.
I could see that.
There is one thing that has worried me, and it goes to the fundamentalist behavior of what I was mentioning before, and that is that I've seen people use graphs to illustrate their point, and it's been deceptive, incredibly deceptive. There's one graph that kind of shows a long decline of measles and so on, but what it doesn't do is focus in on the close-up bit where there's a cliff where immunization came in and it goes whoomph and just drops like a stone. So if you look at it from a long distance, it just has a slow decline, and they say, oh well, this is just thanks to better cleanliness and hygiene. But when you get close, you and look at it properly, it doesn't say what they say it says at all.
No, this is called the why vaccines didn't save us graph, right? And it shows the progressive decline of infectious disease, and that was in part to things like our ability to recognize disease, to diagnosis for the disease, the ability to isolate people, to recognize that was really what was going on, the educational status, the nutritional status, all those things were improving. And that did have an impact, particularly not on incidence, but on deaths, mortality.
Death rate,
yeah, and if you look at the mortality rate, yeah, it was a much more survivable disease. And you see, measles became less of a death sentence, although it's still a death sentence in parts of Africa where medical care is hard to come by. But focusing just on the mortality is entirely the wrong idea for what vaccines do. And yeah, we had brought them down pretty substantially. We dropped the incidence. So it was no longer necessary to have hospital beds for every kid who came down with a secondary infection from measles. So it's highly, highly disreputable way for them to present the data. And honestly, I think the people who put that kind of information together are being dishonest and are consciously dishonest, as opposed to most people who are just suckered in by bad information.
Yeah, I think that you are thinking of the right graph concordance, and the particular one that Cliffjumper's talking about. There was a hangout, I believe it was hosted on Fiona's channel. Yeah, it was actually the death rate, and that's interesting how they just so many gaffes with the way that they present that information. I mean, for one, there actually is, when you look at how the measles death rate goes down, and you got this long tail of where there's pretty much no death rate, then there's the arrow pointing introduction of the vaccine. You can still see a little drop down if you look close enough on the graph. Well, obviously, I mean, if there's a dip down, even when you look at it on that scale, obviously it's pretty significant. Well, of course, when you zoom in, you look at that part of the graph, it's significant. Again, even this is where science reporting is difficult, because even talking about the death rate, anytime you talk about a rate, you mean a rate with respect to what denominator? Typically, you talk about death rates as, for example, number of deaths per year per 100,000 people in the population. So your so-called sort of annual per capita death rate, But when you look at infectious diseases, the survivability of a disease isn't counted in terms of how many of the arbitrary 100,000 people in a population. It's looked at as the death rate, basically your risk ratio of losing your life once you've been presented as a clinical incident. So it's death rate per clinical incidence. And when you look at measles, for a specific example, that's something that the death rate, so you're not looking at 100,000 people in a population. You're picking out, for every 1,000 people, year after year after year, out of 1,000 people, what are the odds that, or like how many do we expect to survive in 1942? And then, 1962, there was a big difference. If you took 1,000 measles diagnosed cases, a larger number of them were expected to survive. That is, the death rate per incidence would have been a lot lower. And I mean, people who are savvy about doing this sort of population health analysis or health policy analysis don't seem to have trouble understanding that those two things need to be teased apart. The death rate as a function of incident, death rate per incident, versus the incidence rate in a population. And yet, you start getting in with the anti-vax crowd, they will present you a graph with death rates, but then when they talk about it, you hear the words out of their mouth, they start talking about incidence rates and infection rate, and it's difficult to keep track of all the little shifts they do in conversation.
We're joined by Fiona, and I see that there's a lot going on. The viewers won't see this, but a lot going on in the chat. I'm going to go to Fiona, and then we'll see where things develop from there. Fiona, welcome to the show.
Hello. I actually wanted to, in a way, address something you were addressing earlier, and you were talking about how culpable are the parents who are swallowing the alarmist messages about vaccination, and I wanted to share with you something that I came across. Now, I'm going to give you a sentence, and I'd like you to attempt to fill in the last word of the sentence. Okay? And it's to do with some of the anti-vaxxer people that are now actually saying that the measles outbreak is a hoax. Now, that's one thing they're coming up with. But somebody else has also said this one, that the reason there's so much venom being directed at anti-vaxxers is because mercury is in, finish the sentence.
Yeah, the MMR vaccine?
No, that's not the word.
Oh.
No. And this is from a well-known anti-vax site.
Mercury is
in fillings?
further away from the sun.
No, DPR is close. Mercury is in retrograde.
Oh, I heard this. I heard this.
They're using astrology to explain why people are having a go at some of the anti-vaxxer crowd.
You said I was close. Moving further away from the sun, isn't that in some way?
At least you were dealing with planets and not the metal.
Yeah,
Mercury.
but I think, what was the word you used?
Retrograde.
Isn't that the same as moving further away from the sun?
No, it's to do with retrograde motion. It seems to be going one way, but it looks like it's going the other way.
Oh, okay, yeah.
Yeah. It's when our planet in its orbit catches up to
anyone else, so I get 1 point.
You do. You do. When I came across that one, it was about 2 o'clock in the morning. I actually went and woke my husband up to tell him about it because it was a brand new one on me. I've heard a lot of nonsense.
I'm sure your husband loved you for doing that as well.
Well, I made him try and guess, but he didn't get it. But he was wide awake after I told him what it was. Now, when you've got parents getting information like that, when you have people that run an anti-vaccination site spouting stuff like that and spouting it to the media, quite often you have to say to yourself, what chance do parents have?
Well, I agree with this, and let's bring it back to a point closer to my heart, and that is the criminal responsibility of parents for not vaccinating or not giving them, more generally, not giving them the medical treatment that they deserve or ought to have, or which has been proven to be most effective. I think, in general terms, I'm very much with concordance on this, that parents have a responsibility, a huge responsibility, but I can't think of any greater responsibility that a human has as being other than being a parent and caring for that child. But I also have a degree of sympathy when they are faced with so much information and so much ignorance and inability to discern the information that they're being given, that whilst I'm almost jumping on Concordance's bandwagon and others that they should be held criminally responsible, I just there's some part of me that holds back from that, because I have some degree of sympathy that they are being flooded with information that they do not have the capacity to understand. Is that a fair comment?
I mean, let's imagine we dial ourselves back to some time when, let's say Darwin, right? Darwin he took the water cure, right, which is a popular fad medical cure for many years, and he subjected his daughter to the water cure as well, which was not, it was ice cold water plunges followed by heated water plunges to treat disease or perception of disease. Would we say that he was abusing his child, that if, you know, when she died, that he should have felt responsible, because even at the time that water cure was somewhat of a fad condition, and I'm sure people advised him against it. Possibly it contributed to her mortality. I can't say. Would we say Darwin maybe was guilty of child neglect?
Well, he might have been. That would all be determined against a background of what was established and corroborated sound medical practice. You know, I mean, if someone says, you know, I've got an untreatable cancer, and then they decide that they're going to fly off to South America and get some treatment by some quack, you know, well, okay, that's not the best thing. And if you're doing that for your child, that's not the best thing. But I mean, you know, if there is no established treatment with a proven track record of success, then you're not being irresponsible. You're admittedly you're moved by emotion and desperation, but you know, you're not being irresponsible in forsaking a proven remedy or course of treatment. So I think where we have to hold people accountable is not because they are resorting to quackery or stupidity. It's when they're forsaking sound, established medical treatments. That's where you become criminally negligent. In my view.
My point, Ozzy, is this: that the availability of information and misinformation is such that can you hold a parent responsible for not being able to sufficiently appreciate which information is the correct information to take?
It seems to me that in every area of the law, you know, whether it's a business transaction or a negotiation, whether you're buying and selling a house or property, a car, a business, whatever, you're expected to exercise your due diligence, even if there's a sea of misinformation around you, and you're held accountable for whether or not you did that successfully or not. And I don't see that it's different when the stakes are even higher.
Let's take a specific. Let's
Sure.
use the example that Concordance referred to earlier, that someone in South California goes to a doctor. They are registered. There's a plaque on their door. There are certificates on the wall. Is a parent being irresponsible by accepting the apparently dubious advice that this doctor is given the fact that, as I say, they're qualified and they've got all the certificates?
I think in that case that it's completely exculpatory. That would exculpate the person because they have exercised their due diligence. They are going to what is supposed to be a competent expert, someone who has relevant expertise and who is charged with dispensing sound medical advice. So there, I think the parent is not at fault. They are really there at the mercy of someone who is not doing what they're supposed to be doing,
Okay,
and I think that exculpates the parent.
Let's add another leaf to this. Let's say that the same parent going to the same doctor has read on the internet that the doctor they're going to is a quack.
Well, then they have every reason to doubt this doctor. I mean,
No, I don't think they've got every reason to it. They're just reading a press report that could be written from anyone.
Oh, okay. No. I thought I thought you were talking. What are you talking about? A press report? You mean someone opined on the internet, or this is they've read in the news that this guy is a quack?
I'll give it even better. They've heard on Fox News that this doctor is a quack. But he's still got his certificates. He's still got his brass plaque outside the door.
If I may, I think that is the time to get a second opinion.
Well, okay, so
you can only get so many opinions, though.
Okay, so you're saying in that case the parent ought to take a second opinion because of a news report on Fox News.
Me?
No, Cliff Jumper seems to say that. What are you saying, Ozzy?
Well, my view is that these things have to be decided in courts. You're going to have a judge, you're going to have a jury, and they're going to look at the circumstances, right? We write our laws, but we also understand that in a trial, the jury and the judge look at relevant information, and they take into account mitigating circumstances, things that mitigate your culpability and your moral responsibility, and then that has an effect on whether or not you're judged guilty or not guilty, and whether or not your sentence will be.
Mitigation tends to go to sentence, not guilt.
No, that was the second half. It can go to sentencing. So I think as long as our laws are sensitive to the mitigating factors, we don't have to worry too much about it.
Well, my question to you is then, it goes back, and to anyone who wants to comment on this, should a parent be held responsible for going to what appears to be a qualified doctor and ignoring other reports about the inaccuracy or inadequacy of this doctor? I'm sorry, I hate to go on about it, but when it comes to criminal responsibility, I think, whilst I want to agree with you, I think it's very difficult to argue in favour of prosecuting parents when they are unable to accurately deal with the conflicting information that's being given to them.
I still, I don't know. I mean, if like this mother, for example, with the strep throat, right, or any parent that's using this the homeopathy, they took the time to research this. They took the time to learn about this, to find out what herbs and what, I don't even know what these people do, but what works for what? What should I get when there's a fever? What should I get when there's this? Why does this work? Why do I use this instead of this? So don't use peppermint for that. You need peanut butter for that. I don't know. So they obviously have the capacity to learn and to research and to gather information. Okay, but they're only using it in one place. And then when it comes to punishing these people, I don't think that I think it's important to remember there's a lot of studies that have been done on this. When someone's done something wrong, okay, we don't so much use the emotional parts of our brain, the older parts of our brain, when we're deciding whether or not to punish, but how much to punish. No, it's the other way around. Deciding whether or not they should be punished, we're more rational about that. But deciding how much to punish them or not. You can still feel bad for these parents because they were ignorant and still set an example for society and still punish them. Right? The emotion doesn't have to be involved at all. And then like Oz was saying, courts do take into consideration all the circumstances surrounding the event, and they scale back or dial up the punishment based on that. This woman, if she's convicted, she probably won't spend any time in a real penitentiary or real prison. She'll probably be in a halfway house somewhere. She's not going to go do hard time. Courts take these kind of things into consideration. But at the same time, our emotions shouldn't have a lot to do with this when it comes to whether or not these parents should be held responsible. We can feel bad for them and set an example and punish. It doesn't have to be one way or the other.
Could I just add here that I think it's quite difficult to expect parents to be able to evaluate how good a doctor is. Surely the professional bodies have a role to play in this. For example, there is currently a doctor in the States who is anti-vaccination. And one of the things that he has said is that measles is nothing more than a fever and a rash. Now, anybody who is a qualified medical doctor knows that measles is not just a fever and a rash.
I think, Fiona, this actually goes back to a point that Concordance made very much early on in the show, that the doctors that he referred to in South California should be up for malpractice as opposed to the parents being held liable. Concordance, am I right in?
Right, yeah, I think they should at least share in the responsibility, and if the advice they're giving leads to the death of a child, they should be legally liable on that.
What I'm wondering is, should the professional bodies be getting involved before it gets to that stage?
Quite often these things do. Usually it's when a doctor refers it to an ethics board, right? And ethics boards at most hospitals will hear controversial treatment decisions and whether or not they're medically indicated or not, or ethically indicated or not. And for that, I'll turn it more over to the philosophers. But the cases where there's really no recourse is when it never hits that level of attention from the medical community, in my experience.
Yeah, well, all these professional boards it's a complaint-driven system. So, like this doctor that Fiona mentioned a little while ago, I believe it's in the state of Arizona. I mean, he's been in the press an awful lot, and it wasn't until 2 people had seen fit to write letters of complaint to either the college or the association, whatever applies in Arizona, that he came under fire. These are complaint-driven systems, and people need to send in letters, or the associations don't sort of proactively go out and seek that people are giving. That the physicians are actually giving qualified advice in their practices.
Can I ask a question regarding what should we do with parents? Do you think it's a good idea to deny services, so to speak, unless your children are vaccinated? In other words, you want to come to public school, you have to be vaccinated. Do you want to go send your child to daycare? Must be vaccinated. Do you want to send your child to a doctor? You know, do you want to come into a doctor's surgery with measles or something like that and infect other children? You must be vaccinated. And that will persuade people to get vaccinated. Is that something that is realistic?
Well, that's already happening here.
I do think that if you start to make life a bit more awkward for those who are choosing not to vaccinate, pretty quickly their philosophical objections will disappear in the face of these extra difficulties. But I think the message that needs to be driven home is that it's a public health issue and that there are measures put in place to prevent a problem with public health for those who cannot be vaccinated. And therefore, if you're not vaccinated, you don't attend public school. You don't use public transport. You can't use daycare. And that's just for a safety issue.
This can, by the way, I'm sorry, Shanna, go ahead.
It's okay. You're going to run into a lot of people that, like, there's doctors' offices around here doing it now, but they have access to the medical records, right? People like public transport and daycares, but daycares do to some degree, but they don't have access to medical records, nor do they have any grounds to demand them. You know, this is, especially in the U.S., this is protected by HIPAA, right? You can't just hand out everybody's medical history like that. So I think that would be a complication with something like that.
So this runs us into an issue of the politics of vaccination, right? In the news recently in the U.S., it's been polemicized. It's got now people are taking sides, and the presidential candidates, U.S. presidential candidates have started to sniff around the issue, where can we get the most advantage from this? And so Christie came out saying, parents should have a degree of choice, that he would oppose, increased government regulations, right? It becomes a regulatory framework question. And Obama, of course, then comes out and says you should absolutely get your kids vaccinated. And now suddenly Fox News is put in this awkward position of having to politicize it, because that's their job, is to take issues which have no political affiliation and make them into touchstone issues. But as I mentioned earlier, it's not one of the issues that traditionally has become politicized, become partisan, right? And they're trying to make it into one. And I think that's the worst possible thing that could happen. And I'm willing to soft shoe around this issue if it's going to avoid turning it into a Democrats versus Republicans issue and just driving the problem even further. So I hope we can make it through this landmine discussion without making it something on which politicians can, ring their bell and get a Pavlovian response in terms of votes. At that point, it won't become a medical issue anymore, and it will become a matter of, party line.
I just wish that...
I want to pause the conversation now, because I have difficulty dealing with the questions and answers, and I know I've gone on about this in previous shows. I can't access them on this show, this screen, so I've got to do it on this one. And there seem to be a couple of good questions from the good doctor, which Shanna's kept an eye on, and perhaps I'll invite her to read them out. Otherwise, I have to squint over there and my glasses. So, Shanna, can you read out the questions that are being asked? And just again, to anyone else that's watching at the moment, you can submit comments, questions, preferably questions, through the Q&A, and also you can join the show on Skype by sending a Skype contact request to Magic Sandwich Show. Shanna.
The good doctor's first question, and I love that name, is, before a parent can deny a vaccine for their kid, should they be able to prove that they have a clue what they are really dealing with?
How to prove of that?
Yeah, but okay, I've got a problem with that question. Oh, not the question, but the potential answer. How much of a clue should they be able to give? And who is going to be the determinator of what their answer is?
Yeah, would this be like a driving test?
Yeah, I was going to use that as an analogy. I mean, that's the thing. You can always. I mean, there's really two separate issues, and I don't know if it helps to sort of get bogged down in the metric issue, like how do we actually measure somebody's knowledge? The issue first is about liberty. I mean, should we even have such a test? I mean, you can complain about driving tests and say, well, do you think that the driver's license test actually addresses what you need to be a good driver? I mean, the question is, I mean, I've said this kind of off the cuff before. I wish that there was a simple, like a driving test, caliber exam before people were allowed to vote. I mean, I've not ever been clear on whether
I'll go further than that, Hogtie. I think there ought to be some sort of test before anyone is allowed to reproduce.
Yeah. Breed.
I know, and it's like what a Orwellian dystopic thing to say. But I mean, a licensing system. I'll tell you who had the best observation about this great philosophical mind. The Keanu Reeves character in the movie Parenthood, when he was discussing what a bad father he had, he says, in this country you have to have a license to drive a car. You need a license to catch a fish. You need a license to own a dog. But they'll let any butt-reaming asshole father a child.
Keanu Reeves logic.
But what?
Butt-reaming asshole. I'm quoting the movie. I'm not trying to sully your show. I'm
not sure I understand what that means. I'm sure I'm too innocent.
Yes.
I will give you a link to a web page that describes.
The funny thing about it is you took the words out of my mouth, because I was thinking exactly the same thing when asked about whether the good doctor's question, whether they should have to have a clue about what they're denying their child to, or putting their child through, for that matter. And it did get me thinking exactly the same thing. You need a license, but you don't need a license to be a parent, and make decisions as a parent as well.
And let's face it. I think that all of us would agree that we are aware of people who we would say, if there was such a license, they would never have been allowed to reproduce. They are not in a financial position to raise a child. They're not in an educational position to raise a child. And it might sound awful to say, but it is the case, isn't it?
I don't know. I mean, I've got a friend who's got learning difficulties and she's partially sighted, and she would like to have children. Her father says no, and effectively, you know, thinks he gets really annoyed when she gets boyfriends and things, because he sort of says, you know, boyfriends leads to sex, which leads to children, and effectively she's not smart enough to have a child, to bring up a child. And I actually think that's quite offensive, because I think she would make a wonderful mother.
Yeah.
I was wondering, very often with any medical procedure, the one thing that the doctors look for is informed consent.
It's tough.
So I don't think that it would be too difficult to get informed refusal when it comes to vaccinations. Because when you vaccinate a child, it's supposed to be informed consent of the parent.
Let's revisit the one correlation we know about, though, and that is a high level of education for the mother.
Well, yes, but that's why I'm saying when you are making sure that a parent is giving informed consent to vaccination, then what you're actually doing is you go through what the vaccine is being given for, what the possible side effects are, the consequences of any of the diseases should the child not be vaccinated. And then we call that informed consent. And if the parent wants the information of what is in the vaccine, then that's given as well. It's in the leaflet with the vaccine. So if we are giving them the information so that they are giving informed consent to vaccination, then surely that makes it easier for informed refusal, because you're just making sure that they've got all that information.
Well, that's what AMA is, right? That's when somebody does, it's against medical advice. They have to sign a paper saying you have been informed of X, Y, and Z. You've been informed of the consequences of not doing X, Y, and Z, and the benefits of X, Y, and Z.
Yes.
And the patient still has the right to sign AMA, so to refuse the treatment based on whatever reason, but it's against medical advice. And that's kind of to protect the hospitals and the doctor. But then there's also, which I think would be nifty, but and we've got rights issues going on, but there's implied consent, which is when the healthcare provider essentially assumes if this person were of the right state of mind and had all of the facts in hand, they would make X decision. They don't have all of the facts, or they're not in the right state of mind, so we can then therefore go ahead and make X decision for them. That's implied consent. And they do that a lot of times with children who, like I think the example I gave last time, there was a car accident, there was Christian Scientists, the parents were unharmed, but the child was in the back seat with a bleeding skull. The parents refused treatment, and they went ahead and used implied consent and took the child, right? And treated the child against the parents' wishes. Then you have to get epidemics, and the sicknesses would have to get to such a point, to an epidemics level, before people could step in with the implied consent and kind of ignoring AMA.
Yeah, the fly in the ointment with all of this issue of consent is that you're consenting on behalf of another person who's not in a position to consent because they're not in a position to appreciate and assess the risks. It's kind of like with Jehovah's Witnesses who say, no blood transfusions for my child. You know, my child can be in a car accident and can be just, you know, bleeding and is about to die of exsanguination, but no, there's nothing you can do about that. You know, we're not allowed to introduce any blood into this this dying body. Should a parent be allowed to say on behalf of that child, no, you're not going to have this life-saving procedure. Well, it turns out that it's even more complicated in the case of vaccines, because you're not making a decision on behalf of a child. You're actually making a decision on behalf of all of society. We have this issue of herd immunity. The whole reason that we have vaccinations is not just to inoculate you against the ravages of some disease. It's because there is a collective benefit. The more of us are actually in on this, the more effective it is. But if not enough of us are in on it, there's almost no point in doing it. So that's those are the two variables here, as I see it. One is that you're trying to we're trying to discuss the issue of consent on behalf of a person who's not in a position to consent themselves, and the other is that the benefit or the risk is not borne only by the person on behalf of the consent. The risk and benefit is borne by everybody else in the society, and we have to sort of get away from this idea of strictly individual rights when the effects are well, they go across the board. They're trans individual. They affect all of us. I'm not big on collective rights by any means, but we have to remember that the consequences here affect everybody, and they're huge consequences.
Yeah, and I want to use that as a launch pad to give a direct answer to the question. But before a parent can deny a vaccine for their kid, should they be able to prove that, do some sort of test or whatever? My answer is I don't really care if the parent can pass the test or not. There are bigger issues. We don't have a system of being able to opt out of not drinking and driving or speeding through school zones, and that people can, if they can prove their competence at drunk driving or speeding through school zones, then they can it's acceptable to opt out of that system. Like I'm sorry, there are other issues at play here, other rights that need to be protected, and the parents. I know some of the libertarians are going to be upset at this sort of observation. It would be nice if parents were better informed and could demonstrate a little level of competence with the medical knowledge, but that's not required to be a parent. And any sort of assessment, whether it's accurate or inaccurate, as to whether a parent actually understands these things, doesn't address the main issues when it comes to population health questions. So my answer is I don't care.
And I agree. That's what I was gonna like. I don't care how informed they are, and I don't care. The issue isn't them and their child, or just their child. It's everybody. So their level here. But I think that what Oz was saying kind of ties into Good Doctor's other question. He says, should a doctor be able to refuse to take on patients who are anti-vax? Does a doctor have a responsibility to their other patients by keeping anti-vax people from entering their offices? Is it not a matter of protecting the most vulnerable? I think that kind of ties into what we were just saying. Yeah. And I think the doctors have the right because they have a responsibility to all of their patients, not just that one. There was a doctor recently who, I can't remember where it was now, but he put up a sign: if your kids aren't vaccinated, you can't come, because his child has leukemia, so she can't get vaccination for measles. Mm-hmm. He's not going to take measles home to his daughter and kill her because somebody thinks they have the right to not vaccinate. They have the right to kill whoever in the hell they want. I think that doctors have not just the right, but the responsibility to take a stand against this, to protect everyone else.
There was one doctor has actually said that he's put up the notice saying that unvaccinated children aren't to come in. He has 20 unvaccinated children on his books, but he has 2,000 other patients. Now he's a paediatrician, and he has, I think it's another 2,000 patients under the age of 1, so they haven't been vaccinated against measles. And he says that if he allows one of the 20 unvaccinated ones to come in, he is potentially going to have 2,000 under 1-year-olds infected with measles.
It's not just that. Who brings a 3-year-old? Sorry, Fiona, but who brings a 3-year-old child to the doctor? And I'll tell you, a quarter of the time, it's their pregnant mother.
Mm-hmm.
That's true.
Yeah. And I mean, especially pediatricians, because you know that there's always going to be a child there. And this is the problem, because a lot of the children who are regulars at pediatricians are the younger babies who already have a problem. That's why they're regulars. They wouldn't be going to see the paediatrician if they were healthy.
Right. The majority of the patients that go to see a doctor under any circumstances, the immune system's compromised in some way. I mean,
yeah. And there has been one case of a vaccinated child playing with someone who was actually infected, but before the symptoms appeared, who managed to take the virus home on his either skin or his clothes and infect his infant brother. So even though the vaccinated child didn't catch measles itself, he was still a vector in taking it to an unvaccinated child. And his mother had no idea the child that he was playing with was unvaccinated. And that just goes to show you that it doesn't even need to be direct contact. With measles, if you're in the same room as a person with measles, you get a 90% chance of catching it. And if you're in a room after someone with measles has been in and left, you still have that high chance of catching measles because it's one of the most infectious viruses we know of. So you can understand why paediatricians would be very wary now of wanting to see a sick, unvaccinated child in their office.
There's a global health issue here too. In the first world, where we've made these efforts to stamp the disease out 20 and 30 and 40 years ago, we have managed to get the disease under control. It is still responsible for about 150,000 deaths a year. I'm quoting 2013 WHO statistics. Mm-hmm. And the fact is, as long as there are reservoirs of the disease, we will never be able to eliminate it in other places. So the fact that we have an outbreak in California endangers Canadians and Peruvians and Finnish and Swedes, because we now have air travel to make those diseases hop countries so quickly. So it frustrates efforts even outside of your local community. It is a global public health issue, even more so now in the era of fast, low-cost air travel. It's so much more important that we maintain a level of effectiveness. And to be clear, the basic reproduction rate being what it is for measles, only schools and communities where at least 95% of the population are vaccinated or resistant are considered to be not at risk. Anything less than 95% vaccination rates leaves the community vulnerable to epidemic disease. And if it happens, we're all going to be really unhappy about it, because again, the lethality of the virus is relatively low, but its contagiousness means that every child will have it. Right? It's a terrifying prospect.
I think it's 1 death in every 1,000.
Yeah.
That's quite high.
Yeah. No, it's actually quite low relative to a lot of other diseases. Generally secondary, which again, we would always have a lower mortality here, but if the incidence spikes, it's going to overwhelm the medical system.
Mm-hmm.
I'm aware that Big Blue has joined us on the last occasion.
I have. I apologize for not having my my video set up at the moment.
Oh, that's such a shame. Anyway, what have you got for us, Big Blue?
Well, I originally wanted to comment on when we were talking about the criminal charges, and I feel like the conversation was missing a big opportunity in that with freedom of speech, we already determined that there are things that you cannot say because they're harmful, like the fire in the theater. And I feel like we should really be going after big sites that get huge traffic for these anti-vax and homeopathic stuff, where we're in this conversation, we're saying that they could be criminally negligent parents, but we're not going after these huge sources that they're going to for information. And the
give me an example, because my immediate sort of like response is, well, how can we, when they are such big organizations, how does the little man actually respond?
Well, I don't think it's a little man. What I'm saying
whatever,
is,
sorry, we're talking over each other. I do.
Sorry.
You go first.
I don't think it's the little man that needs to be going after them. I'm talking about, you know, the government. When we have taxpayer money going to fund the CDC and stuff, and they have to now put out information clarifying stuff like vaccines and the homeopathic stuff, instead of being reactive and putting out counter information. I would suggest that as a government, or governments in all of our countries, that's something that we proactively root out, saying, hey, if you're not a healthcare professional, you cannot be claiming to give healthcare professional advice and not put some disclaimer in there. That way, if they do that, then the parents themselves have nothing back to fall back on, saying, you know, I went on this site, I did all of my homework and such, and then we as the people who would be prosecuting them can go back and say, hey, all these websites clearly state that these people are not healthcare professionals and should not be taking that advice too seriously.
Yeah, I think we kind of touched on that earlier, but Hogtie, do go on.
I have a tough time with that. I have to admit to it being a fantasy that it would sure be nice that if there wasn't some sort of government body, I would be tempted to call it the Ministry of Truth. Oh, that's probably not a good idea. That could sort of stamp out these websites. I'm really, really, really uncomfortable with that. And it's hard because as I've said on the show before, I'm a big fan of evidence-based policy and practice. I don't like medical and public health issues being politicized and polemicized, and that there is a right way to proceed in thinking about scientific issues, and in particular medical and population health issues. And I wish that there was sort of, people would recognize that these agencies that are involved in health policy research are actually the flagships of thinking in these areas, and everybody else would just shut the fuck up. But you know what? As a citizen of a country that has the Charter of Rights and Freedoms, I'm so uncomfortable hearing your suggestion that they should be. I don't know. There are reasonable limitations to free speech. I have to agree with you on that, but we can't limit people's right to call into question the judgment of any government agency. And here in Canada we have Health Canada, and then each province has their own Ministry of Health under various names, and they are government ministries just like any other, and the citizens need to feel free to engage in only marginally harmful sedition. Like, we're allowed to speak out against our government agencies. We're allowed to say that we think the military shouldn't do this or this. What kind of world would it be if we said, well, now the people aren't allowed to speak out against the, sort of the population health branches of the government? I don't know. I have to admit to it being a fantasy, but one that I'm very, very uncomfortable with.
Well, if I can comment, not as much, like, I can see if you want to say not necessarily have the federal government prosecute, but at least to have some kind of clarified law saying, if you are not a healthcare professional, you cannot run a website that claims to give out valid healthcare advice and then have no repercussions when people accept you as a healthcare professional and follow your advice, and then it leads to these problems. I feel like if we could at least have that sorted out.
I suspect to a degree that we already have that.
Yeah, we have that.
What the trouble is that there are people putting up websites and claiming, without the authority, but claiming that they can give medical advice. Now, that's got nothing to do with organizations and such as we have here in this country, and I'm sure we have, or I'm sure Hogtie has in Canada, organizations that monitor people giving out medical advice, but those that purport to give out medical advice don't fall under that umbrella. That's the problem.
Yeah, I mean, there are some systems in place. Like, for example, in your country, Blue, I believe you're American. What is Kevin Trudeau doing for a living now? Right? This guy has repeatedly been in federal court for. I mean, the problem is that then it's a trade issue. It's when you market a product for which you claim has some medical benefit. Those things are regulated federally in the United States, as they are in the UK and in Canada, and individuals that go and market products that are, but the problem is when it's not a product and it's just information. I don't know how. I mean, certainly somebody who presents themselves as having medical expertise or medical qualification and the giving of advice is regulated, but actually even that they don't really pursue those cases. You don't see a lot of. I mean, somebody basically has to hang up a shingle and open up a medical practice and then have somebody discover, well, they're actually not registered anywhere before they start to fake. But putting up a website and just giving out general information that's contrary to, I just cannot see how that sort of thing could be regulated.
Yeah,
There's another thing as well.
Parents have to be.
There, if I may. Sorry. I'll give you a couple of minutes, but I want to have the last 10 minutes for our latest caller. Go on, a couple of minutes each.
I was just going to say, the problem is if you start shutting down websites, that kind of feeds into the conspiracy theorist kind of mentality of they're trying to shut us down. We're obviously telling the truth. It's a dangerous slope to try going for, isn't it?
I'm not necessarily saying that they have to be shut down as much as, if there's like a website out there that has, their sole purpose is to give out viruses and stuff that, it gets a tag next to it on Google saying, this is a high-risk website. Just having like someone like the CDC go as far as, hey, this is what in our country we consider safe medical practice, and this website.
I have a huge problem. I think it goes back to what Hogtie was saying. I think that trying to monitor this and trying to suppress people's speech about it is something that is deeply uncomfortable. Anyway, as I say, I'm sorry, I am going to pause you there because I don't know whether it's a serious call, but hey, Shingen, we've got you back. You look like a cat today, and I thought your comment was potentially interesting, particularly the very last part of it. What have you got for us?
Okay, can you hear me?
Yep.
Okay. So yeah, about the numeration of these episodes, you have, I think, missed 3 numbers of episodes on the go. Like I don't know how to say that. Episodes 69, 86, and 93 are like I can see them on the list of episodes.
I'm sure they don't exist. It's. Let me assure you, it's not a deliberate thing. It's my inability to remember what the last show was, and so in order to make sure that they don't have the same number, I'd probably add 1 or 2 more to the show. But I'm sure you have a much more serious point.
Yeah, well, the other thing. Can I add something to the vaccination and stuff like that from the previous topic?
Sure.
So, well, maybe in more short version, what I think is that in vast majority of cases, medicine will prevent you from dying or will help you get healthy faster or have no effect or difference. On the other hand, if you don't treat yourself, then you will either be very lucky and somehow get healed on your own, or you will die. Or in the case of healing your children who are sick, you may be lucky, or you will be lucky to have one less child to need to take care of. Anyway, so like to put it simply, medicine works and the alternatives pretty much don't. Doing anything but using the official medicine is pretty much endangering yourself and or your children. Now, because you're bound to protect them, if you don't use medicine, despite your best intentions, the fact is that you're failing your duties as a parent, and I think that you should be held accountable. So, despite being very liberal...
Because of that, so you're saying that a parent that doesn't use medicine to protect their child should be liable for prosecution?
Yeah.
I don't think that anyone here is going to have a opposing view to that. But what we're questioning is what is the best medicine and what is the best information that they have. And should someone be held liable for accessing not the best medical advice?
Yes. Well, we've talked about it. But maybe.
Oh, sorry, I thought that was your question. I thought you were going to give us some insight of your own.
No, just putting that
out.
Okay. So to the second topic, to my main one, so to say. Some time ago, I've heard from another atheist who, by the way, is pretty much, well, who likes to bitch about atheists. He's one of these, I'm an atheist, but not in a spiritual sense, but yeah, basically he likes to bitch about atheists and their ignorance or arrogance, more stuff like that. Basically, he informed me that the idea of Spanish Inquisition, of the Holy Inquisition, being that horrible institution who was just murdering atheists and believers of other religions and stuff like that, is just something made up in later times as an attack on Catholic Church, and somehow
I'll tell you what, I'll just read what you sent me. I'd like to ask whether you heard that, supposedly, the atrocities committed by the the Spanish Inquisition is just something that was made up later as an attack on the Catholic Church. That's the question that you posed. So, does anyone want to comment on that?
I wasn't expecting the Spanish Inquisition to come in this, but then again, nobody ever expects the Spanish Inquisition.
Absolutely. Yeah. Anyone else?
I got nothing.
Hogtie, clear your
that was gold. That was gold. That's funny, because I thought of the first half of that. I wasn't expecting the Spanish Inquisition, but Cliff Jumper beat me to it. I was wondering if we were going to discuss the dangers of vaccines at some point. I notice we're creeping up on the 2-hour mark, but...
Yeah, we can do that. I suspect we're going to do that in an after show because we are very close to the 2-hour mark. But chat away amongst yourselves. I have to be away for 2 minutes. I'll be right back.
Could I just say one thing here that I think is important? I looked up the current ingredients of the MMR vaccine, and there is no mercury, and there is no formaldehyde, and there is no aluminium.
Yeah, it should have been one of our trivia questions for the test at the beginning of the show, our little trivia quiz. Which vaccines, are there vaccines that contain mercury? And again, it's ethyl mercury, and it's such trace amounts. I mean, this thing's been proven safe time and time and time again. We are approaching the 2-hour mark. I think it's unfortunate because I know that there got to be some people sort of wringing their hands about, well, we've talked about the effectiveness and the usefulness of vaccines. We haven't really, I think we have a panel here that's assembled that's kind of accepted that there's a lot of discussion about the dangers of vaccines, and we've looked at it to death. And I mean, there's just There's nothing indicating that the vaccines are dangerous in the general population. There's certainly indications that there are some people that shouldn't be vaccinated, but this is something that's extremely well tracked, extremely well studied, extremely well understood. And the only people that are still talking about the woo, sky is falling dangers of vaccines are the nutters who just refuse to actually look at the information or even acknowledge that this is something that's being studied. Mercury. No mercury in MMR. I believe there are some brands of MMR that are not used in North America, perhaps not the UK, that still contain the thimerosal, but it's not not any in Canada or the US. I know that for sure. Remind me, what's the name of the flu vaccine? Fluvival. What the heck's it called?
I couldn't tell you offhand.
There are different flu vaccines by different manufacturers. The ones that is purchased in bulk by state governments and provincial governments, I know the one that we use here in Alberta, does contain the multi-dose ones. This is the flu vaccine, not the measles vaccine. Does contain, one of the manufacturers, the one that produces the bulk ones that we use here, does contain very, very small amount of ethyl mercury in the preservative. Again, demonstrated, well below any sort of threshold where you'd have to be concerned about it. And what's the other one? Is it DTaP, diphtheria, tetanus, and something pertussis. Some versions of that, and again, the most publicly available ones, have very small amounts of mercury in them, again, to safe levels.
It's not
what I'm running out.
Not just at safe levels. The idea behind it is that it passes through the body pretty quickly and comes out in stool.
Yeah, no, the form of the molecule. I mean, putting liquid mercury, into your bloodstream would be crazy. But yeah, I mean, mercury salts is a totally different thing.
It's almost like people don't realize that it's in your walls, it's in your lighting, it's in your, if you have amalgam fillings, it's in your mouth. I mean, it's not kryptonite. We're not going to die from the teeniest little exposure. This doesn't.
Do we want to talk about
get rid of the toxins?
We want to talk about the formaldehyde thing? Like, do we care? There is no formaldehyde in MMR. I don't think there's any in the flu vaccines.
And that was one of the things we spoke about. Yeah, one of the things we spoke about the other day was how the amount of formaldehyde in any vaccinations is, I think it was something like 0.2% or 0.02%. I can't remember what it was. But the human body produces 500 milligrams of it naturally a day.
Yeah, the liver. There's dehydrogenases in the liver that take ethyl alcohol and produce what's formaldehyde's one carbon longer cousin, acetaldehyde, and take methanol in trace amounts and convert it into formaldehyde. Again, it's totally soluble. It's excreted in urine. I mean, these are not dangerous things.
Isn't it also one of the building blocks for the ribose sugars?
Oh.
The formose reaction. Formaldehyde can go to ribose.
I mean, and honestly, unless somebody's convinced that the FDA, if you're in the U.S., the FDA, the EPA, and OSHA are filled with nothing but incompetent people, I don't understand the issue with this half of the time.
I think it goes back to Wakefield. It does go back to that. Because that was so high profile. And I think the problem was that in the UK we dealt with this, the Wakefield saga. But I think the US can be occasionally quite insular. And they didn't notice this was going on at the time. So I think maybe the US is playing catch up now.
I think this current vaccine problem that we've got is somewhat similar to, we had something last year, or about, I can't remember, it was about a year ago anyway, and there was an epidemic in Swansea in the sort of bottom end of South Wales, and it was hundreds of cases in a short amount of time. And there was just a crazy rush to get kids vaccinated because of the Wakefield thing. Lots of kids hadn't been. And maybe it's going to take a few, you know, epidemic cases to give people a kick in the butt to say we've got to do this. This, you know, this isn't something you can mess about with. There's another thing that popped through my head while we were discussing this. Much of the stuff, much of these things comes down to a lack of understanding of the science of the effectiveness of vaccines. Do you think it would be a good idea to have lessons built into the curriculum to arm the school children with the knowledge that they'll need for the future as future parents?
Yeah, I think if people were taught here, at least in my area where I'm at, you know, what reliable sources are isn't taught until you reach a college level, and most of those classes, not most, but a good chunk of those classes might not even be required for your degree, right? Like taking a nutrition class, that's not really required, but there you get a lot of, they teach you what the good sources are, what the reliable sources are, how to recognize reliable sources in good testing, and how to recognize crap. But I think a little bit of that and a little bit of logic would go a long way if it wasn't in the higher education and they just integrated into all of it.
Can I make the suggestion that I suspect DPR is about to draw a breath and make the same suggestion? I actually came prepared today, really ramped up about the dangers of vaccines and about this issue about reliable sources of information, and WTF is wrong with people that just keep hammering on this message about autism and you know, mercury and all these other things, the poisons in vaccines. I would be happy to sort of unleash that in an after show. We could sort of let the after show be a little bit more focused on like we talked about vaccine effectiveness and about, you know, on this show, the main show, we talk about vaccine effectiveness and effects on population health and how these things are assessed. And the after show might be a little bit more nutty and contentious, cantankerous fight with why are we even still having this discussion about all the poisons in vaccines? And I have a few thoughts about if you're on Facebook or on Google+, you've seen these photos of young baby Ian Gromboski, and I have a few thoughts about that story, which might cheese some people. I'll leave it to DPR to decide if it's after show worthy.
Yeah, I think that's a suitable time to stop this show and open up an after show. And the after show is pretty much for anyone that can get in. Every time I do this, I'm somewhat frightened that no one will get back to me and whatever, but all you have to do to get into the after show is to send me a Skype contact request on Magic Sandwich Show. I'll send you a link. I think from previous experiences, everyone that's here now somehow and for some reason gets an invitation to the next one I provide, but I don't know. I'll try my best. But on that bombshell, thank you all for watching. We'll be back in 2 weeks' time on the main show, and we'll see you then. But hopefully we'll see you in the after show as well.